It's good to see you all. Very impressive turnout on a gloomy morning in Boston, and just delighted to have this great room full of leaders of our community. So welcome all, and I think we're in for a very stimulating morning. As you know, the Boston Foundation is Greater Boston's community foundation. Our mission is to improve the health, vitality of our community through philanthropic giving, but also through helping to illuminate the challenges and problems and opportunities facing our city and our region. And the Understanding Boston program is a continuing series of forums where we are bringing outstanding research and analysis of these issues and problems before the public. And we take this role very, very seriously. We believe that whatever else needs to happen, a vigorous, robust public discourse about the issues and problems facing our city and the region is the predicate to successful action in all cases. And in this particular event, we commissioned the Citistates Group in the person of Chairman Neal Pierce and President Curtis Johnson to do a metropolitan analysis or regional analysis of the Boston region as part of their City-States series, which, as many of you know, has taken them to more than 20 regions where they have performed similar analyses. And we're very grateful to the Boston Globe for printing their report in the tabloid Boston Unbound, which all of you have at your places and many of you have received long before today. And also grateful to the Globe for giving Neal and Curtis a very significant space on the opinion page to print important excerpts from the report. Not everything that they have to say will be new, but I think we will find much of it very confirming of issues we are focused on locally. But it is also provocative and stimulating to have a comparative look, and the fact that they have looked at more than 20 city-states and performed similar analysis, I think gives them a perspective on the issues and problems that we have that really isn't available anywhere else. I have referred before to Neal and Curtis as the Alexis de Tocquevilles of our time. Their itinerant wanderings around this country have really put them in touch, probably more than any other two Americans, with the dynamism and vitality at the grassroots and at the community level in this country. And they believe, as I do, that it is in the daily encounter between seemingly intractable problems and American ingenuity at the local level that solutions and important innovations are hatched. But it's important that those solutions and innovations be shared and circulated. And we're certainly, this community is a great source, as they point out in their report, of innovation. But we can't be too proud to take advantage of ideas, breakthroughs that come from elsewhere. And part of what we hope this report will stimulate is a look at what some other communities are doing that we might successfully adapt here. I also want to mention, before introducing Neal and Curtis, that this program and the whole Understanding Boston effort of research forums and convenings like this is supported by something called the Civic Leadership Fund at the Boston Foundation, which we started 3 years ago. And as we ramped up this effort, on which we're now spending a couple $1 million a year in terms of the research and forums like this one, it was not going to be possible to support this level of effort inside the regular Boston Foundation budget. And so we started the Civic Leadership Fund, which this year we expect to be more than $600,000, mostly in small contributions from individuals, and I see many of you in the audience today who care about this and want us to keep doing it, and we're very, very grateful for those contributors to the Civic Leadership Fund. It really has been an indispensable resource for programs like this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing Neal and Curtis. I think many of you are familiar with Neal Pierce. Has been a syndicated columnist with the Washington Post Writers Group for many, many years, was once upon a time the political editor of the Congressional Quarterly, one of the founders of the National Journal, and currently the chairman of the Citistates Group. Curtis, the president of the Citistates Group, has spent much of his career in Minnesota in the Twin Cities, has had an illustrious career in government as chairman of the Metropolitan Council of the Twin Cities, as the chief of staff for former Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson, head of the Citizens League in Twin Cities, and has also been a policy advisor to other public officials. As I said, I think we are favored with the presence of two people who are more in touch with what's going on in this country today at the local level than anyone, and I think we will find what they have to say about us very interesting. Neal Pierce and Curtis Johnson.
Thank you, Paul. It's been fantastic to work with you, and we finished our writing on our report last spring, but the event goes on, and we keep running into new opportunities, new ways to engage what we found, and how your Boston world is changing even before our very eyes. Indeed, I was thinking about it this week. You're sort of thinking about your region and its place in the world. It's sort of an anomaly. Last year, you pulled off some dazzling bioscience deals. Your junior senator came within a whisker of being elected president of the United States. Harvard, which many people consider the world's greatest university, continued its historic plans for expanding and more than doubling its campus into Alston. Your Red Sox overcame a jinx of nearly a century to win the World Series. Your governor, a nationally recognized Republican, labored mightily to draw industry and jobs here. So how come you've just been identified as the only state of all 50 that lost population in the year 2004? Why haven't you truly recovered from the recession, which took a staggering hit of a couple of 100,000 jobs or so, 5 or 6% out of your economy? How can you look forward with confidence when you seem to be losing young, well-educated people to other states and attracting as new population, essentially foreign immigrants, a significant chunk of whom disappear into off-the-books and semi-underground economy, even though others are vital parts immediately because of their skills of your economy? In such a complex situation, there have to be multiple answers, and there have to be, I guess, a number of recovery routes or strategies. And there's one road the greater Boston region simply can't avoid. It has to get really serious about its growth dilemma and its near worst in America shortages of affordable housing. We made a central point of that in our report. I see some of the folks like Barry Bluestone and Eleanor White here this morning who have made it a passionate cause of theirs in recent years to do something about it. I'll come back to it in my remarks a little later. But I do think, before we get there, that some broad context setting might be in order. What we as a team were struck most by as we approached the Boston metro region, all of that should come first, come back then to the specifics. The fact is that while we've been writing our reports on American metropolitan regions, city-states as we like to call them, for the better part of 2 decades, we never impressed one that ought to be more superbly prepared for this new century of the intellect than Boston, with its globally renowned universities and its financial skills and its sheer innovation and its laboratory to product breakthroughs. You know the strengths, and they're pretty formidable. But it's also true that we never encountered a region that at first glance seems so disinterested in its potential competitors and in their best practices or the creative business civic partnerships forged around the world in the last 20 or so years. I see Hugh B. Jones is with us this morning. It was a big breakthrough when he got Mayor Menino and Paul Guzzi and the Chamber to launch your first city-to-city leadership exchange program, beginning with a trip to Atlanta in the mid-1990s. But frankly, a lot of other cities have been doing it for a long while. Charlotte, since it began with smokers going in railway cars from one town to the other in the 1920s. Even today, Boston strikes us as a hotbed of contradictions. It continues to excel in experimentation, new ideas, lots of intellectual ferment, fonts of interesting ideas bubbling out of your academic institutions and your consulting firms, and scores of pretty savvy public interest groups, several of those represented here this morning. Yet as a region, you've seen sort of risk-adverse and poor at pulling off system-wide changes. And pardon us, we do sense this complacency, even in the face of global competitors spread from Austin, Cambridge to Seattle, Austin, Texas, and Cambridge, England to Seattle, Washington. All these regions around the world anxious, given a chance to snatch some lunch off your plate, if not the whole lunch if they get a chance. Biosciences, for example, seem triumphant here, but 41 other states have life science programs, and city-states across the world are out to attract Boston's workers and businesses, offering them sunnier and less costly environments. We detect a largely missing Boston gene, born perhaps of your very preeminence and first in so many fields. The gene is collaboration. Combat over turf seems what Gloria Larson described to us as the slow drip torture method here, or as the Reverend Ray Hammond told us, we've made a lot of progress in Boston, but tribalism, parochialism, and aversion to cooperation still stop us from getting things done. So what can be done about leadership in an era when the old business vault is dead and few folks, the model of a few folks making a decision for all others seem to be so out of date? We did have one especially strong finding, the potential for this region's vast and world-renowned university sector to take a far stronger role than it ever has in the past. As prominent as that sector may be, the universities and the hospitals are geographically rooted here. They are unlike some corporations, which can quickly disappear. They become your region's largest employers, pretty sure your largest landowners too. They're the big show in town. Indeed, as the Appleseed report of a couple of years ago, organized by the Boston Foundation with the 9 largest research universities, as that report showed, they alone have an economic impact, cumulative impact of $7.5 billion a year. Add together the whole university sector, and it's just humongous. So the question we pose is this: are the colleges and universities ready to assume the role that's accorded to top dogs in every city-state across the globe to be the key regional conveners and policy leaders and project and deal makers? Well, that's a difficult thing, because what we were told repeatedly talking with university leaders is, well, maybe we could lead a little more, but someone needs to ask us to do it. Thought was that no university president or chancellor would want to get it out there in front and be seen as the leader for fear of offending others, or even worse, being rebuffed. And our reaction was, oh, if the leaders of this absolutely remarkable, globally remarkable collection of academic and health institutions, all of which, by the way, go back to their charters, were founded for public benefit, can't find a way to sit down and plan strategically for the benefit of the region they share, what hope is there for leadership of any kind in our times? So our report has a raft of suggestions about how the universities could collaborate on a whole bunch of fronts. Nitty-gritty town-gown relationships, including real estate expansion impacts, compare notes and talk more among each other and how they're doing that. Putting out a warmer welcome mat in this sometimes frosty region for students, akin to the very interesting innovations begun with Judith Rodin when she was president of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. A research collaborative we suggested to help local governments and institutions. And then a focus on a central problem here and in American society more broadly, growing economic and educational disparities. It's sad and alarming in this region, which literally gave birth to America's ideas of shared democratic rights across lines of birth and class, driven a lot by education, to see it breaking into two camps. On the one side, a college-educated cohort with comfortable and rising incomes, and on the other side, people of color, immigrants and others, many living in your older cities and suburbs, subsisting on dramatically lower incomes and lagging far behind. Our report did acknowledge lots of university outreach programs already operating here, from school tutoring to special assistance for new immigrants. And while no one suggests Greater Boston's academia could or should produce one master plan for greater social cohesion and less inequality, we do think there's a collective step your higher education community could take, namely creating a small university secretariat to keep track of all the society healing outreach programs that are being advanced, and there's a lot of them in your colleges and universities. Actually, there's a significant step forward in that regard through the Goldberg Seminar Series, currently focusing on higher education's role in the greater Boston area. Well, that effort is organized by the Boston Foundation, co-chaired by Tom Finneran and President Richard Freeland of Northeastern University. The Goldberg effort, I think, has begun well with an inventory of university outreach efforts, and it has already begun to bring together a lot of university leaders who normally don't sit down in the same rooms together very often. We would go a step further, though, to an annual Goals and Progress Conference of the Boston area universities focused specifically on social disparity issues. We'd have the presidents and the chancellors, especially including those of Harvard and MIT, to show the flagship leadership, come personally to express their concerns, place the disparity issues in broad context, telegraph their concern, examine how they can make the secret of education, which they represent to the globe, work for all sorts of classes and groups of people within your own region. With that imprimatur, the conferences could invite faculty from all across the region to do what faculty do best: develop and debate new ideas, challenge some of the accepted wisdom, add to the knowledge so that you can then move towards much broader front of informed action around these equity and opportunity issues. Kurt, you want to pick it up?
If you do as we do, which is to go to a region and begin to scrounge around looking for relevant data about the strategic future of the place, and then you ask around what people are working on and what they are worried about, you're almost inevitably going to encounter a couple of surprises. And one of those in this case was a bunch of issues that we usually discuss in policy circles under the fuzzy abstraction of the workforce. And it did kind of surprise us that when people would close their doors and realize that they were talking not for attribution, they began to talk about things that would wake them up at 3 in the morning. And one of those was the effort to try to fill critical jobs. That really surprised us in a place like this that seemed to be just bristling with economic success. Even while we were here, you did a study showing that half the people who come here for college leave when they're done. Half of those go someplace new, not home. 75% of those cite reasons other than cost of living for choosing someplace else. Data show that 35% of the population here lacks the most basic skills demanded by the region's economy. You've got over 1 million people of working age who've only finished high school. So you begin to describe this sort of worker shortage profile, and people say, well, you know, that's a chronic condition, but it's also cyclical. The thing to do is just to be patient. Wait. It'll take care of itself. It always does. But in the meantime, you look like one of those places now noted for having a growing number of jobs going unfilled, while you have an alarming number of people looking for any work they can qualify for. Not a particularly good combination. So we went around looking for the system. Well, there must be a system here. This is a smart, sophisticated place. We kept asking, what's the strategy in place here for actually preparing a workforce? And we got all sorts of evasive answers, and finally one day a helpful consultant pulled out a chart, and it was enormous. Somebody had actually graphed the non-system of the Boston metro area for workforce. And it had hundreds of boxes representing all the nonprofits that are competing for a piece of this action. And he said, I know what you're doing. You're saying, geez, this is not organized. This is not clear. There's no line of command. There's no way to see, who's in charge. He said, you could have clarity, but you might not get better results. We think you get more creativity, more ingenuity, more innovation out of having all of this sort of sloppy-looking competition. Well, we thought, okay. But again, if you look at the data, At the high end right now, foreign applications to American graduate schools are down 28% just in the last year. If you look at emerging economies in China and India and Japan, you see the universities there are producing 5 times the number of PhDs in science and engineering as Americans are on an annual basis. People we interviewed said, you know, we used to make a living on people coming here to graduate school. They fall in love with the place, find a great job, and stay. Now they're going back to India. They're going back to China. And at the low end, those immigrants, the only group that saved you from slipping further down in the population statistics and in the job-filling challenge, most of them are entering not at that high end with the H-1B visa, but at the low end, taking jobs that other people won't take. But guess what? These are the people in your society that are the least well prepared for where the economy is going, and you have to combine that with your distinction of being a state that leads the nation in underinvesting in the very public institutions on which that part of the population relies if it's going to make any progress up that ladder. So we look at this issue of workforce and say, maybe the cynics are right. Maybe this place is ripe for a perfect storm. The national economy expands, there is a national worker shortage, and your high cost of living causes you not to be able to fill critical jobs, and you begin to leak employers at the same rate as you're now leaking graduating students. Well, nowhere does that issue show up more prominently than in the healthcare area. Now here you would just think, boy, this is an unalloyed success story. You look at all the claims to top-tier fame and distinction. You know, 1/3 of all the drugs during the year we were interviewing, new drugs, came out of this place. You've got hundreds of these bioscience companies. You get $1.6 billion on average in research funding from the National Institutes of Health. And we recall when we interviewed Michael Porter, you know, he said, yeah, I know all the stories about, you know, losing the fishing, losing the textiles, losing the mini computer, losing the telecom, but he said, this is one we can't lose. Okay, you'd like to take that, but then if you ask, as we do, what people are thinking about and worried over, you discover, well, if you begin to peel back all of this constellation of bioscience and healthcare advantage that the Boston metro region enjoys, at the very nuclear core of all of that are your distinguished hospitals, 23 of them, 16 of which are teaching hospitals. And if you look at those more closely, those are the places with scary, critical shortages in personnel. The administrators, if they're honest, will tell you they are under deep, chronic fiscal stress. They will tell you that in the efforts to do things that are more rational and maybe do things together more often, that there is this highly sophisticated form of tribalism that blocks collaborative efforts. They'll talk to you about revenue leakages into physician-owned specialty clinics and niche, smaller hospitals. They worry about that NIH funding and how long it'll be before a reddened nation in its congressional manifestation begins to say, why should Boston get so much? They worry about the degree to which graduate medical education funding, which was cut 30% in 1997, might get cut again, and that is the lifeblood of the revenue stream for 16 of these hospitals. They worry about, as Neal has already mentioned, the 41 of the 50 states, and maybe it's more than that by now, that are chasing you in a high-stakes, big-money game. And then if you maybe just look at the hospital, we found Clayton Christensen, probably the current guru about innovation and change in the business model around the country over at the Harvard Business School. And he says flatly, the hospital as a business model is slipping into the mist of history. I mean, it doesn't work anymore because all these things are slipping away. The most lucrative revenue-generating activities of a hospital are now slipping away into these more specialized kinds of centers. So we thought, well, what would you say about all this? Would you just encourage the people in the region to hold on to this wonderful advantage they've got? Play defense? And we thought, no, this place is ideal for a bold maneuver. And the bold maneuver is something like this. If there's one thing this nation needs desperately, it's a radical reinvention of the health care system itself. You think about it. I collected some headlines about the health care system. soaring health care costs, rising numbers of people without insurance, workforce shortages, undocumented immigrants receiving free care, overcrowded emergency rooms, cost shifting rampant, stratospheric drug prices, razor-thin operating margins in hospitals, oppressive regulatory climates, ridiculously high medical liability insurance premiums, an aging population, excessive use of expensive technology, not enough of the right information technology, greedy insurance company, greedy physicians, oppressive administrative overhead, medical errors, and of course spoiled consumers used to getting anything they want anytime they want it and having somebody else pay for it.
You missed Medicaid, about to eat the Massachusetts
Yeah,
state
about
budget.
to eat the Massachusetts budget. I mean, that's the system we have, and one in which 80% of the money goes to 10% of the medical conditions that are demanding treatment, while over 50% of all of the medical situations are caused by behavior or misbehavior, and that only gets 10% of the cost. So our challenge to you in the report was, this is a place that has all the elements. You've got all the brain power. If New York is money and Washington is power, Boston is brains. There's just no excuse here for not being able to assemble the brain power to get at this. You've got the Massachusetts Health Quality Council. You've got participation in this business-led leapfrog group nationally. There is the growing science of evidence-based medicine based on quality. There is the intersection between that and the information technology. There is the opportunity to rationalize the points of access with your constellation of community clinics and smaller hospitals, which, by the way, get the same quality outcomes for 20% less cost. You have the opportunity to actually rethink the role of the consumer and expose the consumer to the cost structure as well as to the choices. And you could indeed, given what everybody says who's an expert about this, show the whole country how you could cover everybody here with health care and not spend a dime more than you do today. That would be a nation-leading, bold maneuver, and there's no reason why it couldn't happen here except for this recessive collaborative gene. Neal?
He's getting better all the time. Of course, I have two little things you forgot to mention, Curtis. Community colleges, which you were referring to when you were talking about the training of the immigrants. You just didn't use the phrase. Why not a community college of Greater Boston with a single executive responsible for quality and not the degree of defensiveness one institution to the other that we have today? Or immigration. What's happening with the New England congressional delegation? I frankly have not done the research yet. I want to talk to the people over at the New England Council about this. But what are you doing about immigration policy as a region? You got a big stake in not having such a restrictive immigration policy that it shuts off the flow of workers coming into this country. I want to talk for just a moment about growth, physical growth. From quaint New England villages to old mill towns, you have America's most distinctive town and country setting. It should be your signature landscape, ferociously defended, but instead you've been letting it give way to generica, strip malls and big chain boxes and stamped out subdivisions, highways a congested mess, serious threats to your water supplies, disappearing open countryside. From 1950 to 2000, 3 times as much Massachusetts land consumed by development as you consumed in the preceding 3 centuries. And you're still devouring land even with negative population growth. But the issue is not just saving Currier and Ives New England. It's joined at the hip to your through-the-roof escalation of housing prices, scaring away young professionals and seasoned workers alike, people who are really critical to a strong economy. At the same time, Massachusetts town-by-town home rule laws mix perversely with a whole bunch of very meddlesome state regulations to induce many towns to just say no to new in-town housing units, notwithstanding your roaring regional need for more affordable housing. So you have housing costs and your economic future on a collision course with your treasured home rule and political deal-making first culture. You just have to solve it. It can't be left. We see some important daylight in the work of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force, remarkable combination of business, labor, university, foundation, environmental. I've always thought this might happen to me one day. I forgot to turn it off. Goodbye. I'll talk later. Sorry, Eleanor, I was right in the middle of a good sentence about your task force. The task force is combined business, labor, university, foundation, environmental, advocacy groups. And they did take the time to sit down, actually over 2 years, study their differences in their initial positions and look for alternatives. This was an undertaking in which the Boston Foundation, to its credit, took an early and key convening role. The participants came up with an ingenious deal, in a sense, so-called smart growth overlay districts to develop significant new housing in town centers, near transit stops, in older commercial areas, in exchange for the state government providing targeted fiscal incentives to deal with added school costs, which is the big bugaboo, the big fear in the towns. As you may know, the legislature blessed the overlay districts, now called Section 40R in your zoning code. That was a major breakthrough. It did fail last year to provide the special school aid that's intrinsic to probably making this proposition really attractive for a highly significant number of towns. You may have seen some press reports about some towns initially saying no, Kingston, Dennis, Sandwich, Action, Braintree, Hopkinton, and others. But what I'm hearing from the cell phone says I failed to answer the call. Okay, sorry, I'll turn it off altogether. What I'm hearing is that there should be a good opportunity to move forward, but a much better opportunity to make a real difference if the regular yearly housing grants are made. They sound in a sense unfair. Why just help with housing in these particular places? But the overall percentage of the state budget that for housing that it would represent, for school aid rather, that it would represent would not be great, and it could have an immense impact because you really have to, I think, to be thinking, unless you can increase the supply soon and significantly of affordable housing, the danger to really crippling your state economy in the ways we're beginning to see with the population growth and so on is very real. At the same time, we put some of our talk into remagnetizing your great collection of older cities so that they become a major focus for growth and for both for residences and for business. The puzzle here is how to take the growth that seems sort of hot in terms of values in the center of Boston or in Cambridge or Somerville and project it into your Lowells and Lynns and New Rivers and Fall Rivers and New Bedfords, Brocktons and Lawrences, because notwithstanding their high poverty levels, some of these are already showing such promising revival signs as renewed downtowns, recycling old mill buildings, restored neighborhoods. Just take a look at Worcester and Providence, for example. Works in progress, but very important progress. Practically all the older cities are connected to the greater Boston economy by commuter rail. We believe you need a lot of strategies to make these the important bedrooms and workshops of the 21st century for Boston. You need to think in a regional way about what your opportunities are for growth and for housing and for where industry should go rather than just more rings of development around 495. And a policy that way would be most appropriate for this region given its special nature. Sprawl can really do well in Arizona and Nevada, but it doesn't need to have its home in Massachusetts. Shall I talk about energy?
I think you should.
Energy. Greater Boston has, we believe, a compellingly attractive opportunity to leap forward in this century, not just outpacing the Chicagos and LAs and Dallases and America, and that opportunity could be in energy. In one sense, energy is obviously an Achilles heel in this region that is bereft of significant fuel sources of its own, certainly no fossil fuel sources, at the mercy of places like Texas and Saudi Arabia. But on the other hand, energy could be a golden opportunity for this area because of its collection of skilled scientists, laboratories, and capital. Why not, we'd reason, invent and pioneer your way to a renewable and really green future? Such a future encompasses, of course, conservation, wind and solar, other renewables, highly efficient new office buildings like the Genzyme building that was featured on the back page. You'll see a picture of it on the back page of that Boston Unbound report. and the scientific skill to know how to make the fossil fuel to renewable transitions, not just blindly, but in smart, well-timed ways. Our report points out Mayor Menino's Green Buildings Task Force, with its goal of involving all of Boston's building and development industries, from major landowners and financiers to labor unions, reaching all the way to the potential of real estate investment trusts, pushing the critical financing side of green building. We refer to the seriousness with which the Romney administration is now taking the perils of global warming to your coastal region, the efforts of the Green Roundtable, Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, and more. But we warn that New York, California, Washington, and other states are starting to leap forward very significantly in green energy and could harvest a worldwide cornucopia of business demand for all of the green energy methodology ahead of you, unless you're really on the ball with this. We note that energy retrofitting of existing buildings, not to mention new construction, could spark a century of construction job demand. Interesting social twist to this. In contrast to the highly touted biotechnology, pharmacology sector, green energy has potential benefits for every group within the society. Scientists and high-tech workers, of course, but also hundreds of thousands of tradesmen at construction sites, plus businesses and homeowners able to enjoy the security of lower cost and reliable energy, a benefit for everyone in a region that becomes more competitive itself in the process.
It's probably a good time for us to also say thank you again, not only to the Boston Foundation, but to the entire metropolitan Boston community for the privilege of looking you over. We enjoyed it, and despite the seemingly caustic criticism in some areas, we hope that you understand how deeply we admire this place and how much concern we share for it. And just a couple of parting shots. The leadership pattern here must change and is changing, and if you're uncomfortable with change, it'd be a good time to pack. Just while we were interviewing here, two of your largest leading financial firms took off and are now run either from Charlotte or Canada. You can look around in any sector and find those examples. You're still on top. You're still winning the game, but the rules are shifting, and you got to do a couple of things differently. One is to recognize that there are other places doing good things too, from which you might actually learn something. Just remember, you got Kurt Schilling from Arizona. Okay? Secondly, you got to get past the ironic amusement with the retirement of people like Chad Gifford. It seems to kind of ring all the intonations of the passing of the last Brahmin. Okay? That era is gone. And your leadership, if it's going to come, is going to come probably from the nonprofit and philanthropic communities. It's probably going to come from a different sector than it has before. That needs to get honored, needs to get supported, and needs to get busy.
And by the way, it needs to be more broadly geographically defined than the city
Absolutely.
of Boston or one or two close towns.
And for goodness sake, when people come to ask you questions and they point out something that looks genuinely absurd, you're going to have to get over the notion of explaining it by saying we've been doing it that way since 1630. Okay? Remember, there's a thin line between leading and lagging, and this region's been on top before only to see its superior advantages wither and wander away. If it's going to be different this time, you're going to have to do a lot more than play defense. Thank you very much.
One of the things I love about these guys in this report is they just didn't point out the issues or the problems. They have put forward in this talk today and in the document some very provocative proposals and ideas. And I'm sure that in this room, knowing many of you as I do, there's quite a reaction. And so we've left plenty of time for a discussion which Neal and Curtis want to have. I'm going to just take the privilege of the of the moderator to ask an initial question of you both, because I'm sure that you encountered this, and you hinted at it a little bit this morning, that when you point out this, what you call the lack of a collaborative gene, there are many in our community who would say, well, we don't want to be one of these cohesive places like Charlotte or Atlanta where everybody gets together and decides what to do. Because if we became like that, that would cancel what is our true competitive advantage, which is the innovation, the space there is in this community for new ideas. But what comes with that is a difficulty in cohering a community, more fragmentation than we're comfortable with. So is there that kind of conflict, or could we have it both ways, in effect? Could we remain as innovative as we have always been and yet figure out some new ways to cohere the necessary force and cooperation that we need to attack some of the problems that you described? And we'll open it up.
Yeah, Kurt will have some ideas on this. You should be able to have your cake and eat it too on this. That is, remain highly creative in many respects with all sorts of, because you got all these sources of wonderful ideas, but then find the occasions when it's really important to agree. It makes me think for a moment, why does agreement not take place? One is so many brilliant people, everybody has a more brilliant solution than the next person's. That could be one part of it. Another part of it is, though, a politicized atmosphere in which there's sort of a political checkoff on many, many ideas, and a pretty ingrained and, you could say, rigid political structure that only wants to let things go through its way. And does not take time. For instance, I would have thought that the Millennium Task Force on housing should have been embraced more fully and quickly by the political establishment. You did make huge progress. You never would have made that if you hadn't had the 2 years of work and careful pulling together. But the political system sort of looks around and says, well, who are you? Rather than saying, this is us and you finally are helping us overcome a major problem.
I think we're also guilty at times of engaging in convenient oversimplification. When you talk about this issue, some people immediately think, oh my God, you're trying to get us to all sing Kumbaya on Thursday night at the same time. There's a long spectrum between Kumbaya around the campfire and riots in the streets, where everybody's doing their own thing recklessly. And I think what we were trying to tell you is that on certain critical issues, where the only sensible strategy is to combine your brain power and get complementary forces in the same room, that's where you need to practice the arts of collaboration. If you look around the country, this is happening at least on two very visible fronts. One is just local communities getting a lot smarter about engaging the public. Instead of lecturing the public, deciding everything for the public, running the gauntlet of the obligatory hearings, and then doing what you were going to do anyway. Okay? I mean, much more sophisticated forms of handing people the information usually reserved to experts, engaging in a patient process where people understand that information and then become owners of a solution broadly shared. And on the other front, business is back, I think we've discovered as we interview around the country. But not in the old form, not like the Boston Vault or the Phoenix 40 or by these various euphemisms that dominated the decision-making structure for half a century. Business is back now in region after region, convening, leading, but not dominating. And the people around the table represent what the community looks like and feels like. And in those places, they're identifying a strategic agenda and making assignments and getting it done. When Boston took a leadership trip to Chicago, we interviewed some of the people that went on that trip. They said the thing that just astounded them about that was if Chicago identifies something that ought to get done, somebody gets assigned to do it, and there better be progress by sundown. While we here in Boston seem content to admire the problem for another decade. Okay? There is that kind of collaboration that is springing up around the country, and I guarantee you it is in atmospheres just as political as Boston ever imagined itself to be. So
no, that's not possible.
Okay, we're going to open this up now. We do have a microphone. You may not feel that you need it. I would ask just two things. Please identify yourself before you ask your question, and please, for the most part, confine yourself to asking questions as opposed to making speeches of your own. Okay, the floor is open.
Hi, my name is Bill Coyne, and I have a leadership question. It seems to me that in Boston there is this deep-seated suspicion of solutions by outside experts being imposed on people who are not really empowered in the context of the solution that is being put on them. And I'm wondering if the universities are going to be the leaders here. Isn't there going to be a resistance, and can the kind of change you're talking about happen without grassroots involvement? And if that's required, how is it going to happen? And is there going to have to be some kind of a transfer of power in order for these changes to take place?
I certainly think if you're going to have more university involvement, it has to be with a more delicate hand. It can't be the expert walks in, takes a look, and walks out the door. If you look at the best examples now happening around the country, those where you have very low-income communities cheek by jowl with great academic institutions like Penn or Trinity and Hartford and so on, there's been an immense effort to learn how to work with, on a long-term basis, those neighborhoods. So that there's a dialogue that gets going, and it doesn't start with we don't know what's best for you. This is part of what the academia has to learn. There's our divisions. First of all, there's a sort of just a different way of operating between the way academics operate and the neighborhood operates, and then you have all the exaggerations of that in today's culture, with cultural differences just between the types of people that are associated with both too most often. So there needs to be a lot of work, but it can be done, and there's some really great examples of it out around the country. We named some of them in our report, and there are many more that are really developing very fruitfully. And so I don't think that it needs to be in that old us and them context. It can be done much more sensitively with much better results, and therefore over a longer period of time more effective.
Remember, too, the quote that Neal gave you earlier about we need to be asked? Because the flip side of what you're asking about is that too often nobody's asking for this help in any form under any terms. It's talking a little bit out of school here, but we both remember a couple of winters ago being with Mayor Menino in a meeting with him and 12 or 13 other mayors over in the Parkman House near the Capitol. And it was not long after 9/11 had happened. They were discussing, as you imagined, Homeland Security and what sort of regional approach could be taken and what did they need to know that they didn't know and all this. And the discussion went on for about 20 minutes until my colleague here had the temerity to say, well, do you think there might be anybody just across the river that would know something about this subject? And there was about 20 seconds of stunning silence in which people tacitly acknowledged that they hadn't really thought about that. So in some respect, the problem is not that they're going to be domineering or too dictatorial. The problem is, so far, we're not really asking them to assemble this brain power.
Good morning. My name is Ralph Cooper. I'm an executive director of a small nonprofit that services men and women who serve this nation and their families in the community, the community of color in the city of Boston. And it was interesting to see that the leadership that you said probably will come from the nonprofit sector. And as a small nonprofit, this collaboration that you're talking about has somehow often eluded the small nonprofit because of a couple of things. Fear of being swallowed up, and secondly, the pure fact that people and organizations and institutions aren't giving like they used to. Could you talk a little bit about the role the small nonprofit, especially those in the community of color, are going to be able to play in this leadership vacuum?
Well, let me just say a quick thing in response that I think an assumption that we're making, even if we don't say it explicitly, I know it's running in the background of our personal software, is that you're likely to have a lot more clout if you are in some collaborative arrangement, maybe with a lot of other organizations like your own, that all alone you're going to feel lonely and you're not going to feel like you've got enough influence. I mean, that is one of the payoffs of collaboration that you get for running the risk that somebody is actually going to take a piece of your autonomy, is that you end up really having much more influence and many more seats at the table. But it's a tough drill. I think you're asking a very piercing question.
We've run into the same issue, and our colleague Manuel Pastor from University of California, Santa Cruz, has been writing about community groups and how they relate to regions. And since your city is so small, we should think about your region anyway, in terms of the relationship. You're not just dealing with the city of Boston proper or Cambridge or what have you, but a larger region. And Manuel says that there are lots of barriers to getting a conversation going from the top down, but they're also from the bottom up. How do we fit into this? Will we ever be listened to? Is there a role for us? And he said it takes some risk-taking to do that, and it doesn't always pay off. But if you think about vital long-term issues like job availability and improvement of the community college system or what have you, there's some major issues that you don't want to have carried off by other folks without being at the table and part of the debate yourself about it. And I imagine increasingly you don't want to leave entirely to the political system to take care of for you. You'd like to be at the table directly and not simply speaking through a surrogate. But this is where we have to in this country. It's as hard as that is to make those transitions, and as easy as it is sometimes just to do one's own work in one's own neighborhood. If you don't get into the larger issues, you're not having an impact, and that I can see. That's you're nodding your head, and that's obviously a huge need. Manuel says that the region should be the place where you can, however, as opposed to state politics and national politics, which are highly polarized and bitter now, red and blue and us and them and all the campaign tactics and everything. He said at least in the metropolitan region, you should be able to have face-to-face and race-to-race conversations. And the real role of regional organizations and people who want, whether it be civic organizations or foundations or all of them that are interested in having the whole region work well, is to make sure there are ways to have those conversations and that in the process people's voices are heard on the one hand, and secondly, that the collaboration expectation is there'll be some action at the end.
My name is Margie Ahrens-Bear. I noticed that one of the institutions that you did not address had to do with the media. And there are some good news stories that are happening in this area, the Emerging Leaders Program at UMass Boston, which is based precisely on a collaborative model, a higher education partnership, other areas. And I wondered to what extent, there's a problem with the media in that there is an emphasis on the negative story. If there isn't friction in the story, it doesn't make it into the paper. And I wonder if you could give us your assessment of the role of the Boston media as it confronts or fails to confront some of these problems that you have analyzed.
What time is our air ticket?
Well, I don't know quite how to answer that. It's interesting. We all have our relationships with the Boston media, including us as we work through on this project for its exposure to the public. But I think the Boston media shows the best and the worst of media tendencies. Sometimes it does do careful, broader looks at certain issue areas, and other times it's just quick with the typical journalistic. What unusual and bad happened yesterday, and how do I focus on that? The mentioning of the work with the younger leaders that Sherry Penny has been involved with is an interesting example where I would find even myself somewhat at fault. It's interesting to know that it's there. You want to remember to mention that it's a nice thing happening, but it doesn't have the cutting edge of talking about who replaces the vault tomorrow, or the cutting edge of talking about major social disparity within the society at the same time. So it's hard for us in journalism to see the whole picture and give it in balance. But we can always do a hell of a lot better than we do.
Tough question.
Good morning. I'm Wendy Everett from the New England Healthcare Institute. I'm in the back. Good morning. I really appreciated your comments and certainly have been very grateful for the work you've done. NEHI has been able to bring together some very intense competitors to work collaboratively because we've been able to identify common ground problems. And you've given us some good examples to work on going forward, whether it's hospitals or providing coverage for the uninsured. As you looked at some of these other critical areas that affect our ability to attract and retain workforce, did you find those same areas of common ground in housing, in energy, in some of the other key vectors that are going to keep Boston, Massachusetts, and New England very vital over time? Excuse me. And if so, how would you point us in those directions?
Well, we should certainly start by saying that our encounter with you was one of the signs of hope, because indeed your institute is trying to do, struggling to do exactly the sort of thing we were recommending as strategy. Interesting question, though, as to whether there were the same signs on these other fronts. I'm not sure that I could point to any at this point. Can you?
No, and I also think that institutions like the great healthcare institutions, I mean, part of it, they need to be looking far more seriously at the community health issues, at housing issues, at the community college preparation, and what larger consumer of community college graduates is there than the hospital system? Mm-hmm. And is the hospital system taking a collective, strong role, including working with state policymakers on the funding, development, administration, improvement of your community college system? I mean, I think that's where some of the need is waiting. The same thing obviously exists in the housing front.
The other piece of it, I think your question gets us to, is we tend to think on any front where we've identified a problem that we can point to a program to solve it, or a change in policy, or a ramping up of more revenue. And more on the list that you were giving us, what we're talking about is a weary, if not failed, system architecture. That's the hardest thing for us to get to. Our politics stand in the way. The media is not helpful in trying to look at things from a system point of view, whether you're talking about energy and how we might be more energy independent, or whether you're talking about the K through 12 school system that nobody else in the world ever imitates in America, hasn't changed systemically in 150 years. But we have the greatest difficulty looking at these things as systems and analyzing their dynamics as though they were an exercise in physics, and looking at the forces that come to bear and the incentives that drive people to behave one way rather than another. If we can learn to do that, and again, Boston, hub of the brain power, okay? If we can learn to think about the large-scale architecture of systems, we might be able to be more active on all these fronts at once. So.
Good morning. I first wanted to thank both of you for your comments. There were several pertaining to leadership that really resonated with me. When you talked about the difficulty in filling critical jobs, when you spoke about the leadership pattern that must change, and when you talked about certain critical issues in which we need to practice collaboration, I do have a question. I first wanted to make a short comment that there is a critical issue in the community development field which has brought a number of organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, universities, community-based organizations together. And that is the lack of people of color in the leadership of the community development field, which is certainly not different from any of the other fields as you look around even this room. But it is an issue which we feel is critical to our field, and we have identified racism, as one of the fundamental reasons for this. And I was wondering, in your conversations with people in Boston, did racism at all come up? Because you didn't talk about that at all in your comments. My name is Pam Jones, and I work for the Local Initiative Support Corporation.
We certainly heard race mentioned as an obstacle and a problem, and the Boston history with race is not easy. We did not hear it at the level of intensity that we had expected raised, either among African Americans whom we were interviewing as a rule, though we had something of a fair selection, not a huge selection of African Americans, but a fair selection, and we talked with some of the community groups. But we were not hearing the race issue as the central one at this moment. The one was more of one of opportunity and how do we make things happen. If we had focused on that area, we might have heard more. And I think you raise a good point that way.
My name is Sidney Topol. I returned to Boston 14 years ago after spending 19 years in Atlanta, Georgia. During the 14 years that I've been back, I've seen companies like Digital, Raytheon, Western Electric, Lucent, GTE Sylvania pretty much close its doors and downsize tens of thousands of jobs. During this period, other states were actively engaged in attracting companies of that size, not only domestic but foreign companies. Here in the state, the theory of some of the councils that were created, like telecommunications, software, interactive media, was we can grow our own companies and create jobs. I think that concept has failed. Would you comment on that? We, as a state, have not been in the forefront of attracting industry that creates high-wage jobs. Why?
Well, I think that it'd be fair to say that most of the testimony we ran into takes the line of reasoning that you were describing, that, in effect, the metro area and the Commonwealth is not likely to succeed in the old game of just trying to attract somebody to come here that pays well. Indeed, they can probably get their labor costs lower and have climate that seems to be appealing to more people by being some other place. You witness the trouble you're having in biosciences with so-called vertical integration, getting the product to the commercial phase and making it happen here on the manufacturing side. Most people we encountered, I think, believe what you were pointing to, that the future lies in continuing to tap the talent for innovation, for ingenuity, and to build things here, and to hope that you don't just give them away as they mature to somebody who offers lower labor cost in a sunnier climate. I'm not sure that what do you think, Neal? I mean, most people, I think, would not say that it is a policy that's failed, but is one that continues to carry pretty big risk.
It created the jobs.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of jobs being created close to the R&D function. Where the jobs are not being created is in the manufacturing side, and that's, I think, has been identified as a major problem.
You're still rolling out golf balls in New Bedford, but it's by robots.
So the lack of manufacturing jobs and the severe loss of them It's happened in all the northern industrial states, but it seems quite severe here. And I think there is an interesting issue that is raised, though. Why aren't there a couple of sort of new ones that sort of took off and stayed here in terms of manufacturing strength in the last 10 or 15 years? Maybe there are some, and I'm missing the names.
Good question.
Good morning. My name is Charles Yancey, and of course I want to thank the Boston Foundation for bringing this all together. As I look around this room, I reached the conclusion that we really have an embarrassment of riches in terms of leadership and commitment for change. We have a wealth of educational medical institutions, but something's not clicking in Boston. I've been on the Boston City Council. I may be the only elected official who joined you this morning. I'm not sure. I'm sure all my other colleagues wanted to be here, however.
Good move.
Could you give us some examples of political leadership? Again, I've been on the Boston City Council for 21 years. I serve on the Board of Directors and Advisory Council for the National League of Cities, so I get around to other places around the United States. Could you give us some concrete examples of successful political leadership that can marshal the resources similar to what we have in this room, and that's inclusive? Boston, after all, is majority people of color. In fact, I don't believe we should be even using the term minority in referring to people of color in the city of Boston. But what examples of leadership around the country have you identified that could perhaps help us in the city of Boston?
Well, if we could go back to Chicago for a minute, at least two examples there responsive to your question. One is a kind of a get it all together Metropolis 2020 project, which was started by senior business leaders but has elected officials, neighborhood activists, organized labor. I mean, everybody is sort of at the table around a very big, audacious agenda that is focused on the whole region, not just one community. It is political, to be sure, but it is collaborative at its roots. The other one is to go back to what elected officials can do and stay in Chicago for a moment, although this is happening in Denver, it's happening in Houston, it's happening in a lot of other places. Mayors getting together, showing that it doesn't matter who's red and who's blue if you're in one region. And, Mayor Daley talks about, they get together with these other 30 or 40 mayors, most of whom are Republicans. There's always a Republican in charge of it. That's very smart. And as Richard Daley described it, he says, we're busy picking all the low-hanging fruit there is around. And he said, the dirty little secret about low-hanging fruit is there's a lot more of it around than people suspect, and most of it falls to the ground and rots from inattention. That if you get together, that you can actually do all sorts of things that positively affect the region, and those elected officials from each of those communities are in the best possible position to do it. And that's one place where he is extremely active on that front.
Well, it's very interesting. The Mayor's Caucus in Chicago is obviously very effective, and Daley even talks up the game. He sounds like a Republican when he gets talking about you. Wouldn't know that he was a great Democratic mayor when he gets in the middle of his talk about has all his Republican suburban buddies in the room, and they're gathering together on an agenda, and they're lobbying the legislature and they're lobbying the Congress. Denver has done extraordinarily well with the Mayor's Caucus,
particularly on growth.
Particularly on the growth issue. Actually, my friend David Soul is here, who knows the Boston Metro mayors set up pretty well. Do you have a thought on whether there's a greater potential here in the Boston region with the Mayor's Caucus?
Sure. Of course. I think it's a unique effort, and I think that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council is to be congratulated for pulling that group together and working with it with the support of the foundation. Mm-hmm. I think it needs to focus on things that can be done, whether they're homeland security or health insurance or different kinds of collaboration. But I think it needs to be those specific things that make sense.
I mean, here's the conversation starter all over the country when particularly electeds get together. What is it we desperately need to do that we have no hope of doing if we don't do it together? And when you start making the list of the answers to that question, you've got an agenda. And that tends to activate people.
And that's something that can even in the sensitive politics of Boston, I believe that there's no reason that city council folks from various towns around here can't get into those same conversations and bring them forward.
I'm struck that you mentioned the healthcare sector, the academic sector, the philanthropic and civic sectors. There are wonderful examples in Boston in the faith-based sector of collaboration, cooperation, both through the United Way and the Faith in Action work and the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, among others. I'm curious if that didn't come up in your interviews or whether you just didn't focus on it at all.
It was mentioned but did not come up as often as the others, I think is the answer. And maybe we were insufficiently, we didn't go after it strongly enough ourselves.
I mean, to partially defend ourselves on that front, we ended up one long summer and fall writing about 65,000 words about your region. No one was going to print that. A lot of things ended up, as the film editors would say, on the cutting room floor that didn't make it in the final focused issues, but we did hear some about it. So.
Hi, I'm Jenna Driscoll of Northeastern University. I have a quick question. You had touched on the need for perhaps a greater community college extension system here. I'm wondering, in comparison to some of the other states in the union that historically have funded their public universities to the point where they overshadow any other university in that state, I'm thinking a lot of the Midwest states that have kind of shining examples of that, and a lot of the cities in which those universities lay are doing very well. I'm thinking like Madison, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, obviously much smaller scale than Boston, with much less of some of the urban problems. But my question is, how much of a hindrance do you think it is that the higher education community in Boston is so segmented and private, and that the public higher education system historically hasn't been as well funded as to create kind of a mass, complex system that can really work with the community, and the community in turn can feel like that's their university, that is their system, and that's going to be there to help them in the future.
We think it's a real problem. Actually, there's a major sidebar in our education story on the very question of the public university weakness, comparatively speaking. Even though UMass has made some major strides in recent years, it still is a major problem that you've always had this high dependence on private universities, because you invented a lot of them and excelled in that department, which was fine during an era in which it was all right if 20% of the population went to college, but does not sound so great in an era in which you need 50 or 60 or 70% of the population to at least have community college, if not further, full 4-year college. So there's a major problem in all of New England, and Massachusetts is maybe the most vivid example of what do you do to strengthen the public system. And we think that requires a big ongoing public debate in your state. There may be ways that privates can play a more continuing role, but it does not solve the problem of a lack of a major public institution or set of institutions. Yes, sir.
I'm Pete Peters from the Pioneer Institute. You comment particularly on the non-change in the K-12 system, of which I think we all agree. My comment first is that in places where something has seriously happened, like Milwaukee or Cleveland or Washington, D.C., there has been a source of energy in the black community. Polly Williams in Milwaukee, Fannie Lewis in Cleveland, Peggy Cafferts in Washington, D.C. And how do we find the sources of energy in Boston? I have busted my behind trying to find them, and I've come up a complete loser.
Well, let me take it.
That's good. We need help at this point.
I think that's a good question. I just gave a speech at Freedom House last week or 2 weeks ago, where I went after the black community and its leadership for not being sufficiently engaged with public education in this city. There are school committee meetings where there's no black leadership present, very few people present. One time I had a black church. I just said, just go to the meeting and be a presence there. You don't have to say a word if you don't want to. They did. The place went wild. Who are they? Why are they here? What are they concerned about? What is the issue? What is the issue? We're not even a presence. We're not even a presence. I talk with black leaders, some political leaders, who talk about education, have never been in the schools. They don't know what's going on in there. So mobilization at the level of the community regarding the public schools is going to be important, and some of you will hear shortly that there's a group of us getting together who are going to put together a citizens commission on academic success for Boston children to review all of the strategies that have been used over the last 15 years to see what is working, what isn't working, and what the roadmap should be ahead. So we are mobilizing some folks to take a tough look and to move on this stuff. But we got to move.
And I remember being in a meeting in this room a year or so ago when the foundation brought in Howard Fuller, a distinguished African-American leader who speaks eloquently about this subject. And I think Mr. Peterson puts his finger on a good point. When we talked earlier about the system failure, it is not just outrage, but I think it is recognition in many of these black communities in these large metro areas that it is a system failure. And while we didn't deal with this much in this report, I'd be prepared to assert here and live with it that within this decade you're going to see a movement sweep this country, and in many places it will be led by the minority community, in which the central conviction is that we can't get all the schools we need by simply fixing the ones we have.
Jean
Just think
McGuire.
about that.
Jean McGuire, Northeastern University. I have two questions. One is I have great hopes for the investment of the universities in the city-state development, but I'm not convinced that either their time horizons or their risk-benefit analysis will lead them to sort of either the annual goal setting that you're talking about or something that's not just about project-based or advisory committee-based consultation. And so I'd like you to speak perhaps a little bit to not just culture, but manner of business and investment changes that would have to happen to achieve that vision of synergy. The second question is that the state's role, as in the state public sector, is noticeably missing except for a few cracks at the over-involvement of regulatory practices. And this city-state can't be successful without leadership in that arena. That arena has changed dramatically during the course of your work. I wonder if you would comment about what the implications of that are for the vision you've set out. Thank you.
Let me come back to your first question first, which was what you're saying is if you're going to get more of a collaborative, meaningful effort by the universities, they're not. Why would one think they would be willing to do more than simply talk about it and point to a few nice sample programs and walk out of the room smiling? I think that's a danger. That's one reason I think that you need to get some of your major university presidents as part of the dialogue and thereby give it visibility. But also, I would hope that if they got talking about these issues among each other and in public, leadership would rise. Now, I can't prove that, but there's some very bright and wonderful university presidents around here, and expectation levels help. If you get them into that kind of a debate about what are the implications of income division and lack of opportunity and lack of connections, and what does it really mean for the future of this region where they do business and where they're dealing across the board with all people that they do deal with, that somehow I think out of that there's a chance that new ideas of investment that make real sense can emerge. But I don't see them emerging another way.
I think in a way, too, your question takes us back to where Paul started this session. that there is this inherent tension between letting 1,000 flowers bloom and trusting chaos theory to sort out creative solutions, and having civic enterprises that are organized and focused and strategically directed toward a limited agenda. And it seems to me that the search here is for the balance that has so far eluded you. Or at least on this latter effort, what you do is you figure out what is it you can't do if you don't do it together and have everybody around the table. What is the stuff to start with? Who's going to be responsible? How many resources do you need and where are you going to get them from? And what's the timetable for defining success? That's the part that you seem to be missing. It is true that the Commonwealth sort of is your regional governance. And sometimes it must seem like it's the parent to whom you're congenitally attached and cannot fire, but is not home much.
We'll have to make this the last question.
I'll be quick. Paul spoke of Tocqueville, and you're speaking of city-states and collaboration, and you're putting it against turf issues, and just basically, it seems like you're talking about a democratic culture. We know that democracy is not just about voting, but about whole sort of democracy. It's everywhere. My name is Gibran Rivera, and I work with Mass Vote, which is very concerned with not only increasing voter participation, but changing the electoral process itself. We're actually convinced that people don't vote not only because they don't know, but because the process itself doesn't lend itself to real democratic participation, particularly among groups that have not been represented so far. What I'm trying to get from you today is a type of endorsement of electoral reform, and I'm referring to all sorts of things, including campaign finance, for example. You're talking about public sector and private sector working together. Well, it's hard to do when the private sector sort of circumventing the democratic process. And all sorts of other, the large system, for example, could be significantly reformed. There are many, many things that we could do to sort of make participating in the formal political process easier, that I believe would actually significantly increase the possibility of collaboration, because there will be automatically less distrust and just more possibility.
I don't have an easy answer to this, because I believe the community should be more systemically, really seriously debating their election systems all the time. I think American federalism's huge failing is we don't have any parliamentary states. I mean, why don't we experiment more? Why do we all have to do everything all the same way? And why can't proportional representation be tested in more communities more frequently? 1630. Yeah, 1630. It's not a good enough reason. Why does a major planning change have to be approved by 2/3 of a town meeting? So that you have this wonderful South Weymouth Naval Air Station potential that could be sunk by just one more than a third in one of 3 towns saying no. So you have some real issues, and I think they deserve major public debate. I think your point is right on target. I don't think Kurt or I have the magic formula with which to make that happen, but it is something that deserves real serious public attention. There's talk around the country now about trying to substitute some voting systems so that you name your first and your second choice, so you have an instant runoff in effect if you don't get a majority. That deserves serious attention and should be tried out a lot of places. Why not Boston? You know, you invented American democracy to a large extent. One area which I think is a way to get people who have not been participating is on growth issues. The idea of having visual representations of alternatives for growth in your neighborhood and getting more people in on a charrette system, or using this software called Community Viz that the Orton Family Foundation up in Vermont has invented, and I think MAPC is looking at. One way to get people engaged in the process is to give them some feeling that they have a voice in the physical form and development of their own neighborhoods. And I think that should be seen as a companion agenda, or one way to strengthen the feeling that everyone's voice needs to be heard in the society, and it's not just things done to you, but what you can do for yourself collectively with your friends and neighbors.
Thank our panelists. I want to thank Neal and Curtis for what I predicted accurately would be a very stimulating morning. I guess the question is what's next, and let me just say a word about what the foundation is up to. First of all, we want to continue the conversation in various ways. Neal and Curtis will be back for some additional forums, but in addition, in late March, we will be releasing the 2004 version of the Boston Indicators Project, which will be rolled out at a BC seminar at the very end of the March. I'm not sure what the date is, but you'll all be invited. And 2 years ago, you may recall that the 2002 edition of the Boston Indicators Project was really the first time the talent retention issue was raised very significantly, because the data was showing that we were holding on to fewer of our college graduates, as Curtis and Neal talked about, and we got that issue out there now. The Chamber has taken it up very seriously, and so we're going to continue to push at these connected issues. They talked about the Commonwealth Housing Task Force, and we were very proud to be involved in that. The work is not done, but I do think it deserves to be looked at as a kind of model for cooperative action that preserves the essential nature of this community and doesn't pretend ask us to be something we cannot be. But we were able to convene an unusually strong and broad coalition behind what we called a consensus housing agenda. And because of the breadth of that coalition, we were able to redefine the issue for leadership as an economic competitiveness issue in addition to a social justice issue, because the sad reality is the social justice imperative for housing has not carried the day historically here in Massachusetts or across the country. But we're going to get action on housing that's going to help everybody because of that redefinition of the issue. And there are other opportunities like that. On workforce, we have a marvelous new collaborative where more than a dozen local and national funders got behind a program called SkillWorks, the largest workforce program ever been mounted in this city, and in this case it's Boston only. But we're making use of this alignment of interests. The fact, particularly in healthcare, but not limited to healthcare, employers desperately need qualified employees. And so they are acting, again, not out of altruism to help people move up to family-supporting wages and good benefits, but because they desperately need those folks. So an alignment of the social injustice agenda that this foundation cares very deeply about with the broader and very compelling economic needs of this city and this region. That's a very, very compelling opportunity. They also mentioned the Goldberg Seminar, which we've been pleased to host here at the Foundation. Again, later this spring, we will be releasing the report of the Goldberg Seminar, which we are characterizing as the first full accounting of the role and impact of higher education in this region. We hope, just like the Boston Unbound report, that it is full of ideas for moving forward, including an idea for a new kind of metropolitan alliance among all the colleges and universities, which may embody the secretariat idea that Neal and Curtis are putting forward. So I could go on. I think pilot schools and charter schools is one of the major arenas in K through 12 reform, where we have all sorts of promising models, but there is resistance to expanding the most successful models where new leadership is required. So I could go on, just as this conversation could go on this morning, but we do have a commitment here to try to get you out on time. But there's a lot happening, a lot to build on. I want to thank Curtis and Neal again. And just think about if this crowd here today, and what a great crowd this is, what couldn't we do? If we really got together. And that's the question we asked at a similar meeting a couple of years ago on housing. What couldn't we do if this whole group agreed to work together on that issue? And we got something very important done. So I'm very optimistic entering this new year, as we all should be. Thank you all for coming.